Hello, everyone. On behalf of Studium Generale, welcome to today's lecture. My name is Ryan Whittingslow, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Groningen, and I will be chairing today's lecture and the Q&A that follows. So tonight's lecture, How the Internet is Killing Democracy, is being offered as part of the National Night of the Dictatorships, an initiative of Pro-Demos. The Night of the Dictatorships is the counterpart of the United Nations Day of Democracy and raises awareness for liberty, democracy, and the rule of law by discussing dictatorships around the world. So today we're going to be hearing from journalist Jamie Bartett about the myriad of ways in which technology, here glossed to mean information technology, poses an existential threat to the democratic norms upon which Western liberal democracies are constructed and premised. Given the events of the last few years, this is a topic I'm sure that all of us have reflected on, and I'm personally very excited to hear what Jamie has to say. Jamie himself is a tech journalist and director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at the think tank Demos. Among other achievements, he presented the BB2 series The Secrets of Silicon Valley and is the best-selling author of The Darknet, an examination of the hidden corners of the internet, and Radicals Chasing Utopia, Inside the Rogue Movements Trying to Change the World. In 2018, he published this book, The People vs. Tech, How the Internet is Killing Democracy. So Jamie's going to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour on the threats that information technology poses to democratic systems, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from you all before concluding at about 9:30. And then I think there might be time for you to, if you want to buy a book, you can get it signed and all that kind of stuff as well. It all promises to be very gezellig. So without further ado, please put your hands together for our guest, Jamie Bartett, everyone.
Thank you. Is this on? Is it on, or am I just booming? Is my voice very loud? It's on. What's Kozelik mean? Don't even an inside joke at my expense before I've even started. And I've never spoken in a pulpit before, so this is a fantastic opportunity. Thank you very much to Ryan and Kirsten for having me, inviting me along to this. I used to live in the Netherlands. I used to live in Zeist when I was 7 or 8 years old. Went to a Dutch-speaking school. By the time I left 1 year later, I spoke fluent Dutch. Can you believe? I can't remember any of it now, apart from lekkerhe and schleutels and a couple of other words like that. But my dad was in Zeist because Apple Macintosh's European headquarters were in Zeist, or they were in Utrecht, and he worked for them. And this was the first time, it was in the mid-1980s, late 1980s, when I really began to use computers, and I, really nobody else at the time, imagined for one moment the way that they would take over our lives. I even remember 10 years after that, when I was graduating high school at 17, 18, coming out of my information technology class. It was 1 hour a week, where we learned about Excel and Microsoft Word, still thinking to myself, this is the preserve of the geeks and the nerds. It's never going to be an issue that I really have to worry about. And I hate computers anyway. And it's remarkable how much things have changed. And it's always worth reflecting on how fast that change has been. It's something a little like, in my view, we are living through the early years of both the invention of the printing press and the Industrial Revolution happening at the same time in a modern liberal democracy. This is the turbulence that we are currently going through. And I think the last few years, the last 2 or 3 years, and probably the reason many of you are here, is because you have begun to see that there have been so many stories about the different myriad ways that democracy seems to be being affected, harmed, damaged, maybe improved in some respects by the advent of this powerful new technology. But I'm going to tell you that all the stories that you've been hearing, Cambridge Analytica, the Russian trolls, and the Russian bots, and the cryptocurrencies, and the automation and the artificial intelligence, all of these, I think, are just they're just tremors. We have an earthquake going on as two grand tectonic plates are crashing into each other. An old analog democracy, built up at a very particular time with a very particular set of institutions that make it work. An analog democracy. And a digital technology that just does not follow the same rules, logic, or incentives. And those two things are clashing. And every time you see a story about how terrible things are, don't read them in isolation. See them as part of the tremor of these two tectonic plates rubbing against each other. And this is why I think most journalists are getting most of these stories completely wrong, and they are missing the point. Democracy, I think, depends not on the very obvious things. I'm sure many of you are going to have these... I'm sorry, I'm distracted by this thing that I'm down there. Democracy. It's a serious lecture. Okay, everybody, this is very serious. The democracy is obviously being benefited in some respects by what is fairly obvious. We suddenly have a platform. We suddenly have a voice that we never had before. The mainstream media, which was the gatekeeper to the information world that we lived in. This was, from there, yeah. Yeah, that's it. Wicked. All right, yeah. Sorry, I totally forgot I even had slides. Just talking away. Oh, yeah. There's some slides. These obvious democratic benefits of modern technology, we have a voice, we have a platform, we have democratized our media. These are the very obvious benefits. Those benefits, however, are blinding us to the fact that there are a series of very boring things that make democracy work. A sovereign legal authority that people trust in, elections that are free and fair that command the confidence of citizens, citizens who are able to take complex moral decisions for themselves, a strong middle class, well-resourced local newspapers. These boring things, these are the things that are being slowly eroded by digital technology, and democracy is going to face a great crisis, and it's not going to collapse overnight. And we're not going to be living in some wonderful crypto-anarchic capitalist society where there's bands of Bitcoin users running around in a libertarian paradise. No, no, no. Far more likely is that democracy is slowly eroded. Confidence in it continues to decline. People don't think it works very well anymore. And they start turning to alternatives. And those alternatives might just be worse. So I'm going to give you 3 short stories about where I think this is all going and why I think most journalists are getting these stories wrong. Let me start with my good friend Alexander Nix, the CEO of Cambridge Analytica. Are you familiar with the Cambridge Analytica story? A little bit, yeah. Cambridge Analytica was the data analysis firm that was working for the Trump campaign and a series of other elections around the world, and they were collecting huge volumes of personal information about citizens, especially in America, and then using that information to target them with personalised adverts. And it's been widely credited in the UK and the US, especially, that Alexander Nix and Cambridge Analytica were responsible for changing the minds of millions of people who would have voted for Hillary Clinton, but ended up voting somehow for Donald Trump because they saw some adverts on Facebook. Now, I don't know if anyone works in digital advertising in this room. It really isn't quite that easy, I'm afraid. And a lot of the current consternation about the fact that this evil, he looks like a Bond villain anyway, and he's called Alexander Nix. I mean, he had to be a villain of the piece somehow, didn't he? It's become a kind of lazy excuse, I think, among liberals to blame Alexander Nix and Cambridge Analytica and Facebook for the fact that their candidate wasn't very good. A lot of liberals, I think, are incapable of understanding why so many people voted for Donald Trump. And it's easier to blame him than to look inwards. The story as it has been told is that they developed this psychological warfare tool using a very special technique called psychographics. And it went something like this. All of us in this room sit on an Ocean personality domain score. All of our personalities are unique, but they can all, each of us individually, be placed on 5 different measures of our personality traits. And it's called this Ocean score. And Ocean actually stands for something. It stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, openness, did I just say openness? Sorry, agreeableness and neuroticism. And all of us are somewhere on each of those 5. And do you remember that about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe a bit longer, there were all these surveys on Facebook about asking what sort of personality, fill in this survey to learn what sort of personality you have. Did anyone ever fill one of those in? You Dutch are far too sceptical, aren't you? You're nowhere near as narcissistic as the rest of us, because millions of people filled this survey in because they wanted to be told what their personality traits were. I don't know why, but they did. Millions of people fill this survey in. What they don't know is that this survey is calculating their Ocean score, but it's then correlating the Ocean score against their Facebook likes to work out the relationship. And once you have hundreds of thousands of these surveys, you can start building a model, which will say that, well, people who like The Godfather and Kate Bush and Oasis, I'm talking about myself here, obviously, but are over this age, but didn't go to university, but did do this, they tend to be very open. They tend to be slightly neurotic, etc., etc. And you can build an individual profile like that for each person. And that is what they did. They used Facebook likes to work out the personality profile types of every single American. And the idea is that you could receive a personalized advert based on your personality. So you, sir, are highly neurotic. I can tell just looking at you. You're going to get an advert that's going to be tailored to your fear about gun control. You, Ryan, however, you're not neurotic at all. I just had dinner with you. You're going to get a very different type of advert that's going to play to the fact that you're very open and very liberal. So this was the magic sauce that this guy was selling and that the Trump people were using, and everyone was saying, my goodness me, this is mind control. I mean, it all sounds a little bit suspicious to you, like it probably doesn't really work that well, because that's the problem with this story. There's no evidence that any of this worked. No evidence. I'm extremely skeptical that this made any difference whatsoever. But that's the way it's being told, the way it's being used. In fact, the story of Cambridge Analytica is far simpler. They were doing what more or less every single political party now routinely does. They bought 5,000 data points on every single American, data points that are widely available, legally, you can buy them. Do you own a gun? What car do you have? Your mortgage reports. Do you own your own house entirely? How old are you? Are you married? What magazines do you subscribe to? There's so much of this out there. There's a whole industry out there that buys and sells people's personal information. They bought that and built profiles, 5,000 data points on 250 million Americans to work out what they cared about, what they were interested in. Trump's not the only people doing this. Everybody's doing this. So many people were staggered at what happened there and then realised, my goodness me, they're not alone. In fact, they're probably not even the most sinister. They went to the Trump team and said, we have all this data. Would you like us to work with you? The Trump team said, yes, thank you very much. 13 members of Cambridge Analytica staff went to San Antonio, Texas, where the digital campaign was headquartered during the Trump campaign. They cross-referenced those 5,000 data points against the Republican Party's database of voters, i.e., possible Republican voters, maybe Republican voters, hardcore Republican voters, to work out who were the people that have voted Republican in the past, but not for a while, that maybe we could persuade to vote for Donald Trump. And what sort of things might they respond to? And they built up this model. And they did it pretty damn quickly as well. 6 weeks into the campaign, they go to Brad Parscale, who is running Trump's digital campaign, and they say, we've looked at the data, we have identified 11 million people that we can reach through Facebook targeted adverts, and we think we can win the states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And they said, it's impossible, you can't win those states. They're Clinton states. We know, we've run the numbers. And they said, and Cambridge Analytica said, we have enough people there, we can do it. So they funnel loads of money into targeted Facebook adverts at people in those 3 states. They even change some of Donald Trump's campaigning schedule, so he does speeches there and runs TV adverts there. When election day runs around, you know who wins the election, obviously, but what maybe you don't know is that he won each of those 3 states by less than 1 percentage point. He won Wisconsin by 11,000 votes. If Clinton had won those 3 states, she'd now be president. She won the popular vote, of course, by 3 million votes. So to me, in a weird way, this is actually slightly more worrying because it's completely normal. They were just doing what everyone else was doing, and they were doing it far better. Facebook ran an internal study of how good Trump was versus Clinton when it came to running adverts. And they found not only did he spend a lot more, around $80 million on Facebook adverts, by the way, there was a Facebook employee inside the Trump team helping him to run these adverts effectively. That's another story. Not only that, they were much better at designing iterations of ads. They would run adverts which would test the colouring. So if you ran an advert with red background, they would run 10, one with red, one with blue, one with green, one with pink, work out which one worked best, and then ran those. They were constantly innovating and iterating what they did. They were just better at it. So the story of elections being stolen by these companies, I think, is missing the point. What is happening is far more serious and structural. Elections are changing. They are becoming increasingly about data science, about finding what little thing each person in this room cares about and relentlessly targeting them with it. This is just the beginning of a new way of running elections, and this is what worries me. We think it's bad now. Just wait. This, of course, is a smart fridge. Has anyone got a smart fridge? No, maybe, yeah. I don't know why anyone needs a smart fridge. I mean, people are getting smart coffee machines as well, apparently. They're going to get hacked by, Russians who'll be demanding Bitcoin every morning when you want to have a coffee. You'll have to pay some Bitcoin to get it. I mean, this is crazy. But anyway, all of us are engaged in this mass data collection effort. We are creating information about ourselves all of the time, and we are bringing that into our homes with our Fitbits. Our baby monitors are producing data, our coffee machines and our smart fridges and our smart televisions and our smart cars. More and more is already embedded with chips that are collecting data. All of that data, of course, is going to be used for advertising. I mean, why wouldn't it? Does anybody believe that there's a politician who would not use smart fridge data if they thought that it might help them? Bernie Sanders might. Yeah, he's one of the few people that might. But I don't know, because the Democratic Party definitely would. So it depends how much control he has over the whole place. But this is where it is going. Some new version of Cambridge Analytica will be collecting data about your smart fridge, and they'll work out that actually, by cross-referencing your eating data, they'll work out that you tend to eat at about 6:30 p.m. But at about 5:30 p.m, by looking at all your social media posts, you use slightly more angry words because you're hungry. You know when you're getting angry when you're hungry. And they'll also work out that people that are hungry are far more likely, or angry, are far more likely to be open to messages from candidates that are tough on law and order. And so lo and behold, 5:45 p.m, you'll start getting adverts from your tough on law and order candidate through your smart fridge and your smartphone. Now this sounds like it's ridiculous, but let me ask you this. The first election that I was ever involved in, 1997, was the first time I could vote. I didn't bother voting, but I should have voted. I feel bad about that. If someone had said to me in 20 years' time, elections will be won and lost based on data analysis from thousands of data points that have been collected about you that are then used to build a personal profile of you, which is then run through a free social media platform that targets adverts at you, I'd have been like, what? This is mad. Not that long ago. And another 20 years from now, imagine how things might be on the current path. I'm not saying that everything is lost, but on the current path. And I want you to wonder for a second what this means, not for one result or another, but our sense of what an election is really about. Is an election about a large debate where people thrash out the big issues of the day? Or will it become something which is about finding that personal data for each person and targeting them with different messages? Essentially turning elections into a new form of data science. What does that do to our sense of holding politicians accountable? Because in 10 years' time, each of you will be receiving a perfectly unique advert from each candidate. You won't all get the same adverts. You'll get one that's crafted just for you. How do we hold a politician to account if they are sending 1 million different adverts to 1 million different people? How do we hold a politician to account if those adverts cannot be seen by anybody else apart from the recipient? So the regulators aren't capable of checking whether it's true or not. It's of no surprise to me that the Brexit vote and the Trump vote in particular have been, more than any other vote I can remember, have been said to be legitimate. Millions illegitimate, sorry. People don't believe the result. They think it's a fraud. They think people have cheated. Because the regulators have not been able to check what's being said. In our Brexit vote, people were receiving adverts from the Leave campaign, so no one else knew this until afterwards, saying that the EU was trying to stop British people from drinking cups of tea. No wonder they won it. I'm surprised they only won by 52-48. But no one could see these adverts apart from the people that were receiving them. These, I think, are the problems that we need to think about. Not right now, not this election or last election, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. These are the things we need to start regulating and worrying about right now, because would it not make sense that in the future, the politician that can do best is probably the one that says the most different things to the most number of people that you could then package up and sell to them? And that, by the way, is a pretty good description of Donald Trump. And the reason this won't stop, of course, or one of the reasons this won't stop, is because the whole damn thing is built on personal information. Now, back in the 1990s, a very good decision was made. How do we keep these platforms, these emerging social media platforms or search engines, how do we keep them free? We want people to have them. We want them to be democratic. These people in Silicon Valley were often very well-minded. They wanted to help people. Well, we keep them free by running adverts against them. Well, what do we do? How do we do? Well, so we need to get as much information about people as possible, because that means the adverts are going to be better. And almost by mistake, so began this whole effort to try to figure out what we cared about, what motivated us, what we thought. It is far better to see Facebook, Google, and the others not as social media platforms, but as advertising companies. 90% of their revenue is from adverts. And advertising people are much more like in Mad Men than they are in Silicon Valley. They want to understand you. They want to push your buttons. They want to know you better than you know yourself. And you understand, of course, that what has happened is every single trick in the book is made to try to keep you online as long as possible. Now, when I walk around in London, all I see, I'm going to come down the stairs for a minute, all I see are people like zombies walking up and down like this, staring at their screen. They're banging into each other. They're banging into me because they won't even look up. I mean, I just noticed that doesn't happen here because I think you get run over by a bicycle in about 5 seconds, so it's fine. But the platforms, the phone, they're designed to keep you on here as long as humanly possible, simply because the underlying logic is about advertising. This creates a big problem for us. Have you ever felt, any of you, and I don't think you have, but I have, when you think your phone is ringing and you go to touch your pocket and nothing's ringing, there's nothing there, your phone's not even in your pocket. And it's your body giving you that same feeling, that same sensation, that hit of dopamine that you get every time you hear a beep or a ping from somebody. I think that the attention span of the entire nation of Great Britain has fallen by about 20% in the last 5 years. Because I can't read more than 3 pages without checking my phone. I used to read books, whole books, without even looking up. I can't do that anymore. This is a real problem for us, because otherwise, if we can't do that, we're easily distracted, we're more easy to manipulate, we're not capable of thinking deeply about problems. This isn't, again, a complete collapse, but this is, again, a politics where people are distracted, they're not thinking, they're reactive, they're manipulatable, and again, I think that is a description of, unfortunately, how our politics is going. Right, that's story number 1, and I'm just even got half an hour on that. That's a new record. Okay, right, let's liven it up with my good friend Tommy Robinson, leader of the English Defence League, far-right political campaigner in the UK. This is about the second issue I want to talk to you about, which is fascism and the way that racist and fascist and populist movements seem to have been very, very good at exploiting these networks, been very good at using these platforms. The question is, well, it's partly why, and it's partly whether that's really the true story here. Because I think what is happening is not just that people like him have been good at using social media platforms, but social media platforms have also turned all of us in some way into fascists. Not in our ideology, but in our mode of behaviour, in the way that we engage with each other. And I think the stories that you read about racists and fascists and populists on platforms is missing something, which is all of us are becoming a little bit like that too. And let me explain why. So Tommy Robinson, for those of you who don't know, was leader of the English Defence League, an anti-Islam group that between 2009 and still today was going up and down the UK and increasingly all over Europe doing anti-Muslim protests. They'd often turn very violent, sometimes racists would turn up, they were often very drunk and all the rest of it. And they became extremely notorious, huge supporter of Donald Trump. And I followed Tommy Robinson around for 6 months. I shadowed him everywhere he was going, I went with him. There's lots of different aspects to what that is like and what he's really like. But one thing that you'll notice is this is an old screen grab of his Twitter page. He's been blocked off it now, he's been banned. But he is very, very good at tweets. I mean, he's very good on social media. He's constantly putting information out. He's the centre of a network of hundreds of thousands of people. One of the misconceptions about Tommy Robinson that people don't quite understand is that you imagine perhaps that all he ever does is lives on a diet of fake news, lives on a diet of conspiracy theories, Alex Jones and these crazy people. That is not strictly true. Yes, there is some of that, but far more common is a little bit more subtle. He will walk around all day with his smartphone, and every day people will send him hundreds of stories from all over the world that corroborate his worldview. His worldview is essentially that Islam and the West are incompatible. There's a war going on between them. Politicians and the liberal elite, they know, they don't care about it. And if you dare say anything, if you dare speak out, you'll be called a racist and you'll be silenced. I mean, sounds probably familiar, doesn't it, to the white-headed Mozart that you have in this country as well. So this narrative, you know it. That's the narrative of Tommy Robinson. Every day he receives all of these different stories, but what's very difficult about this is a lot of the stories that he receives that corroborate his worldview are true stories. They're not made up. They're not conspiracy theories. What they are is cherry-picked stories. So he will receive a story about the way that there's been a refugee in Sweden has done X, Y, or Z, or there was a child abuse group of men of Pakistani descent in the north of the UK that the police were too afraid to investigate, or there's claims that 1,000 ISIS fighters are maybe coming in through the borders of Europe. But a lot of these stories are true. The problem is they are very one-sided stories. They're cherry-picked stories, which he then collates together and then puts out in a relentless stream of information that his followers then consume. This is actually quite difficult to confront. This is the omission of certain truths. It's not the complete fabrication of truth. It's the omission of certain truths. The reason this is a problem is, firstly, when I was with Tommy Robinson, I would say to him, Tommy, do you not think you're being a bit unfair? Do you not think you're being Islamophobic? Do you not think that you're tarring everybody with the same brush? And he'd always say the same thing. I'm not. Islamophobia. Phobia says an irrational fear of something. Look at these stories. This isn't irrational. Look, this is from the BBC. Look, this is from The Guardian. I'm not making this stuff up. And then he'd look at me and say, you, Jamie Bartett, you are one of those liberal media elites that's too afraid of speaking the truth, aren't you? And it's very, very hard to actually pierce that bubble. And that is a little bit different. And that is the way that all of us increasingly, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, are capable of creating not completely watertight information echo chambers around ourselves, but we are capable more than ever of creating our own information culture. And we're able to do that by combining lots of true stories together to give it extra veracity. But this, ladies and gentlemen, I think is only half the story. And this is what we miss. Does anyone in here think that they are really in an echo chamber of like-minded people when they're online? Raise your hands if you think you're in one. Okay, not the majority. Not the majority, probably 1 in 5. And you know what? I don't feel like I am either. I don't feel like I'm in an online echo chamber when I'm online. In fact, when I go online, my first response is, who are all these maniacs? Who are these crazy people? What are they saying? I'm seeing different opinions to mine constantly. The problem is, I don't really listen to them. I don't engage with them. I don't really like them. I dismiss my opponents very, very quickly. Why do I do that? Why do all of us do that? This is not an echo chamber. This is a backfire, whereby you see your opponent's views and you very quickly disregard them. And studies have shown that when you enter into a debate with somebody, but you don't really engage fully, or you do it fairly quickly, you both walk away being even more convinced than you were when you met. The nature of online communication, of course, is very quick and rapid and sudden, screaming at each other, butting heads. It's designed into the system. It's all meant to be quick. What's on your mind, says Facebook, when you log on. And I'm normally like, well, this person's just said something unbelievable and I'm so angry and upset. This is a much deeper problem than just an echo chamber. It's about the way we communicate more generally. And this is a great miscalculation. In the 1990s, it was assumed by the great techno enthusiasts of the time that if we had access to more information, if we were connected with each other, then misunderstanding would be banished. Our politics would be nicer. It would be wiser. It would be smoother, because we'd all be able to speak to each other properly. This, I'm afraid, is a deep misunderstanding of how most real human beings actually work. When you are online, you are, of course, utterly overwhelmed. with blogs and facts and charts and counter charts and opinion pieces and news stories and other news stories. I mean, it's too much for anyone to take. And so at that level, you really can only deal with this sort of information overload at a very emotional level, a kind of gut level. These guys are my guys, those guys are not my guys, and I'm going to increasingly filter my world through that. This is what is really going on. Why is this so bad? This is a real problem, because what this does is create a new tribalism in politics, where you don't compromise with your opponents. You don't find bridges to build with your opponents. What you do is you decide what team you're on, and then you just insult your opponents to death. This is a problem because politics is all about compromise, and if you keep doing that, you get to the point where you are in America, where you begin to undermine and even delegitimize the right of your opponents to be able to govern, because they're so stupid and Machiavellian and dangerous and so on. This is where it ends up. This is what's very dangerous about it. And you may have noticed that, I don't know, it's often said that we live in this great age without deference, that we no longer defer to our political leaders. This was the narrative for a long time. The problem is we seem to have an awful lot of big, powerful tribal leaders now, don't we, that we look up to, that's going to solve all our problems. Tribes need tribal leaders. And I think this is what is happening. We're looking to the strong man to solve all these worries. Now, when you go online, one of the problems is that it's very hard for you to accurately work out how angry you are about something, because everyone's angry about everything. You're equally angry with the fact that somebody, as happened in the UK recently, misnamed a certain product, as you are with the fact that the world is probably going to come to an end because of climate change. And it's very hard to work out your effective levels of anger. And what that ends up with is a combination of anger and impotence and a great frustration. And this, unfortunately, is the perfect grounds for a tribal leader to come on in, bring order to chaos, bring stability. This is why the direction that we go in is towards more authoritarian leaders. And lots of studies have found the growing popularity of authoritarians in democracies. 1 in 2 British people, sorry to keep using Britain as my example, but 1 in 2 British people have said that they think a strong leader shouldn't have to worry about Parliament or the rule of law. Why? Because of all of this being overwhelmed and not knowing what to do and needing order and chaos. This is how all of us, in a small way, are becoming open to fascism. Not through the ideology, but through the mode of action. Right, final thing I'm going to show you. Now, I wonder if you can read this. Right, okay. When I was over in the US recently, and I was filming for the BBC this TV series called The Secrets of Silicon Valley, I did 150 miles in a self-driving truck without a driver, in Florida. I mean, Florida roads are just straight, so it's actually quite easy. But nevertheless, this was quite a remarkable thing. I couldn't believe 150 miles in a self-driving truck. Fantastic. And artificial intelligence, obviously, is the technology behind this. And it's one of those things, again, that I think the journalists are getting wrong. They're worried about AI going sentient. You know, like the Hollywood movies, and they get smart and they get wise and they trick us and all the rest of it. Or that one day none of us are ever going to have jobs again because the AI is going to do it all for us. There's this famous joke that the factory of the future will only have 2 employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to stop the man touching the machine. That's not going to happen, okay? We're not entering into a great job zombie apocalypse where there'll be no more jobs of the future. The problem is, we're very good at knowing what jobs we have now that we'll lose. We're very bad at thinking what jobs we don't yet have. These aren't really the questions. The questions are the ones that I put to the people behind the self-driving technology. Because when I was in Silicon Valley, I'd always ask them the same thing. What is the 50-year-old man who left school at 18, one of 2 million in America, who has been a truck driver his entire life, for whom this is one of the best paid, most reliable, most secure jobs that he could get, what is he supposed to do when his industry is disrupted, when he's no longer necessary? I mean, I don't think we're going to ever have, or not for a long time, self-driving taxis. Definitely not in this bloody city, for sure. It's impossible in the town centre. But on the long truck rides, yes, I think that is possible. What's he going to do? And they'd always say the same thing to me, these Silicon Valley tycoons, always the same. They would say, well, we think he should probably retrain as a machine learning engineer or a robotics specialist. And I think, what planet are you people living on? That is ridiculous. That is absurd. The question, therefore, that we have is, are the undoubted losers from the great waves of change that are coming, are they going to be the people that might get the new jobs? Are they going to benefit equally from this great technology? Or is there a risk that society becomes more driven apart, a growing inequality based on those who can use this technology well, who are software engineers, who can work this stuff out, and those people who cannot? That is the risk, because at a certain level in society, inequality, when it gets too great, starts undermining democracy significantly, because the middle class especially are the taxpayers. They're the people who support democratic rights. They buy the newspapers, they join the political parties, and all the rest of it. This is the challenge for us. How do we spread the wealth? How do we spread the benefits in an age where I think great disruption is coming? Now, this is what I wanted to show you. A very short quote. I don't know if you can read it at the back, so maybe I should read it for you. It says, "Machines will take care of more and more of the simpler tasks, so that there will be an increasing surplus of human workers at the lower levels of ability. Technology advances with great rapidity and threatens freedom at many different points at the same time. For example, increasing dependence of individuals on large organizations, propaganda, and other psychological techniques, invasion of privacy through surveillance devices and computers, etc." Now, this reads to me like pretty much a standard Guardian newspaper editorial today. I mean, this stuff is written all the time. The difference is that this was written by this guy in 1995. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, the murderer, the terrorist who killed 3 people, injured several more on a wave of anti-technology violence through the 80s and 90s. And when he wrote this in 1995, when it was published in the New York Times and Washington Post, that looked like madness because no one had a computer. No one could imagine what any of this even meant. This is ridiculous. I wonder whether someone like Ted Kaczynski not only actually was onto something, not in his methods, but in his thinking, but also whether he is the first of more and more people that are going to be like him, that are going to believe this stuff, that are going to decide that they don't really like these machines anymore. I think we're already living through a great technology backlash, which does worry me because I think all the benefits from it could very well be lost. Now, the truck drivers, or whoever else it is who's disrupted, they're not just going to sit around. I mean, they're not going to sit around and say, it's okay because my great-grandchildren will probably be richer than me and they'll be safer because there'll be fewer accidents. They won't do that. French taxi drivers definitely won't do that. But no one will do that because that's not how we live anymore. We went through an industrial revolution, but there was no universal suffrage, like I said. So it could be imposed on people, but it can't in the same way anymore. What I think will happen is this. Luddites, a new wave of Luddites, are going to go out with spray paint and start sabotaging self-driving vehicles by doing fake road signs on the road. This is a self-driving vehicle that's immobilized because it can't move because it thinks everywhere's a stop sign. This is what we will have. We will have this great wave of machine smashing if it gets too serious. And that's a worry. That's a real worry because all the wonderful benefits of this could very easily be lost. That's why it's vital that we figure out ways of spreading the wealth, to make sure people see they benefit from this. So if you think about it, the three things that I've said is we need to sort of update our regulations. We need to make sure that our electoral laws and things like that now work. And this book, by the way, has 20 ideas how to save democracy. The editor made me write them in because he was like, your book's too depressing. You've got to give people hope, Jamie. You've got to give them hope. So I got 20 ideas about how you can save democracy. And some of them are about, we need to upgrade our regulations to make sure that the elections are run according to the same principles and people can trust them. We have to publish all these online adverts. Of course we do, so everyone can see them. But we also have to upgrade our own expectations, and we have to upgrade our way that our democracy works. Democracy hasn't really changed much for 100 years, and everything else around us has. For the older people in the audience, I don't know what it was like in the Netherlands, but when we used to go on holiday, we came back from holiday, we'd taken our photographs on holiday, and then we had to come back with our things, and we had to hand the film into a shop. We had to pay 10 guilders or whatever it was. We'd have to wait 2 weeks, and then those pictures would come back, and they were nearly always shit. And anyone who's under 20 must hear that and think, that's crazy, why did you do that? But it felt like that was normal. The problem is, politics today is basically like doing that still. Our lives as consumers is now Instagram. It's everything quick, easy, as you want. And this is the strange thing about the populists of the world. They're far more in tune with the culture of the day because they promise you immediate, instant, perfect answers. You can swipe left or you can swipe right, it doesn't matter. But they will cut through everything and give you what you want straight away. That's why, by the way, nearly every single right-wing populist is a huge exponent of e-voting. Go and check it out. It's an interesting relationship. They're more in tune with the feeling of the day. So we, whether it's mainstream politics, whether it's the functioning of democracy, have to upgrade as well. But also we have to make sure that we work out new ways of spreading the wealth. Because if we don't, this is what is going to happen. More and more people are going to turn off democracy as an idea, gradually. They'll think it doesn't provide stability, doesn't provide jobs. I don't trust the elections. And this is perfect territory for the authoritarians of the world. Is it any surprise that China and Russia and other countries have been so swift to adopt all of these technologies? Not surprising to me, it makes perfect sense. Imagine some of those Cambridge Analytica techniques being applied in China. Well, you know already that they are. And maybe, here's a scary thought for you, maybe democracy just isn't the best way of running society in an age of smart machines and big data. Certainly not democracy as we currently have it. If you read books about the future of technology, none of them talk about democracy. None of them talk about how society will be governed. And that's a scary thought. And I don't think it's a given. I don't think it's certain that democracies will be the best system of running society for people. There has been a very, very convenient self-perpetuating loop where economic growth for the last 200 years has fueled a middle class which values freedom. And that freedom has encouraged entrepreneurship, which fuels economic growth, which builds a middle class. Maybe that cycle doesn't work so easily in a world of smart machines where it all comes down to how much data you have in software and computing power. And if we can't work out how to upgrade democracy and make it work for people, people will start turning off it. You may have seen the fairly terrifying statistic that people born, and I'm talking across like 5 or 6 European and American countries here, people born in the 1930s, people who are currently in their 70s and 80s, about 70% of them think it's essential to live in a democracy today. They think it's essential to live in a democracy today now. The survey was taken a couple of years ago. People born in the 1980s who are in their 30s, about 35 or 40% of them only think it's essential to live in a democracy because democracy is not working for so many of them. And this is part of the reason. There's lots of other reasons too, but this is part of the reason. And my final word, the bad news is, it's all of your fault. I mean, my fault as well. It's all of our faults. Because we are building these systems It's our data. It's our swipes. It's our shares. That's what's feeding this. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to give up Google before because they've been like, yeah, I don't like Google, it's getting too big, it's monopolistic. I'm going to try one of the other search engines. And then about 10 minutes later, you're like, I think I'm going back to Google because this isn't working out for me. Because convenience trumps everything for us. And we are complicit. We expect news to be free, and then we're devastated and upset when local newspapers are suddenly disappearing. We use Google all the time, and then we're really upset and annoyed when our data's being shared and they've become one of the biggest companies ever. We are devastated that the local bookstores are struggling while we continually order books from Amazon because it's a little bit easier for us. This is the great problem, that we have to accept that we are in some ways partly responsible for this. And that means, of course, that the good news is that our choices, our decisions can be different, and that we can also make decisions about how we use technology and build technology that leads to a different outcome to this. And with that, that's like 5 to 8. And thank you all very much indeed for listening.
Thank you very much. That was great. So I have a bunch of questions here, but I don't really think you're here to listen to me ask questions. So
We
I
want
might
to hear a question from you, dude.
maybe later. I'll say maybe to wrap it up. But I just want to know: are there any questions in the audience? We have a very excited hand in the back. The speed of light just shot out.
I was gonna hold it myself, but I guess I was gonna hold it so I could stand up. If you'll excuse me. I'm also capable of holding it, but sure. Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a master's student in the Department of International Relations, and it seems to me that you're making a lot of assumptions about these social media companies and how they operate. And throughout your presentation, honestly, you made it sound very natural, as of course this is how things played out. But really, all of the problems you mention come from neoliberalism. So you don't even have to look at 200 years of economic data. You can look at the past 30 years where there's this downgrading of political regulation. There's people stepping back. There's this myth that begins to spread around about, oh, there's the thing called the free market and it'll fix everything, completely ignoring all the political factors that allow that quote-unquote free market to continue to exist. So when you say that democracy might not be able to survive with the internet, I'd argue instead that it's not inherently the internet. It's the internet being constructed in a very particular way and reinforced by a particular way and not regulated properly. These social media networks have terms and conditions that are not universally enforced. There are a lot of terms and conditions about, hey, you can't promote hate speech on here. But when pages like, there's some really terrible examples out there of these hate pages on Facebook that thousands of people will report and yet don't get taken down because there's no stick to make Facebook actually comply with these regulations, partly because politicians don't understand, because in America they're old. But yeah, so democracy can survive with the internet, but if neoliberalism keeps undermining both the political and the economic basis on which the middle class is based, on which regulation is based, then democracy can't survive that.
Right, so Mike, thank you. Yeah, so it's funny, that's the question that, were you the person that shouted out Bernie Sanders by any chance?
Yes,
I thought you might be, yeah. But it's interesting because there's a sort of left-wing critique of the internet that is very similar to yours, and it's in some ways overlaps with a lot of this, because I'm not saying it's not because, I mean, okay, let me level with you all. The title of this book should have been, I mean, I pitched the title of this book, not how the internet is killing democracy, but how the internet as currently constituted is undermining liberal representative democracy. But Random House were like, yeah, that's rubbish. It's not going to work. So I agree with you. I mean, in many respects, the sort of surveillance capitalism, platform capitalism is a natural extension of neoliberal economic policy. So a lot of it's very hard to untangle, especially given that the internet was developed and its operating principles were really defined in the 90s. If they'd been defined at a different time, they would have looked all very different. I don't think the internet as it's currently set up on this model is going to be able to work with representative democracy, but I think it is more than just that market-based system. You said, for example, about how we don't have a stick to beat it with. I have a whole chapter on this. This is about the fact that these networks are international, and it's very, very hard for domestic police to get a handle on it. The UK government is constantly asking these companies to do stuff, and they just don't need to. They don't bother. In the UK, less than 0.1% of online crime results in a prosecution, because 50% of crime in total is now online. And whenever they try to investigate something, for example, hackers from Russia breaking into your home and stealing your stuff from Russia, the UK government follows the leads around, and it finds that the server that they use is based in Iceland and they can't get it. The criminals are based in Russia and they can't get it either. And then the leads just stop. So we have a kind of domestic, national-based criminal justice system, which is so important because if people don't think that crime is going to be investigated properly, they'll turn vigilante. And a network that's completely international in scope. That is more than just principles of neoliberalism. So there is something more going on. In the end, personally, I think we are going to have to investigate and experiment with very different models of ownership of a lot of these companies, and that's probably where me and you would agree. Because at the moment, we have very few cooperative-based internet companies. We could easily run a UK or a Dutch version of Uber that is owned by the people that work in it, or it's owned by the local authority. And we're not really innovating or investigating about how we could do that kind of thing. But we should. We should. We've forgotten. I finished this book by saying the internet was a government project in the first place, funded by governments and academics. And we need to be a bit bolder about what governments can actually do without turning into China. That's the problem.
We have a question down here.
It's a very short one. You put some emphasis on the adverts on social media, like Google and Facebook. But I'm a bit skeptic, though, because all the adverts I get, maybe that's just me, are way out of what... It's not particularly for me. It's never put on my situation, or you know, it's not. Yeah. Have you been received? I don't know if you heard that, but the ads that this woman at the front's getting aren't really very good. And I'm sure you've had that thing where you have you've bought a wallet, and then the next day you get an advert for a wallet again, and it's like, this is literally the last thing I want. The problem is that firstly, it's only going to get better. With this book, I'm really trying to look 10, 20 years down the line on current trajectories. If everything stays as we are, and we keep going down the same path, they will be so much better than they are now. They might still not be perfect, but they'll be so much better. And think about it this way as well. You might not be getting very good adverts, and some of you won't, but someone is, because all of Google and Facebook's revenue is coming from companies that have decided over many years that these are much better than just running TV ads and billboards, because that's where all of their revenue is coming from. So they must be better. And you have a lot of like these weird, creepy stories. You probably heard of the one, this was even 3 or 4 years ago, of one of the big American shopping chains had worked out what sort of things an early pregnancy woman would be buying, what sort of products. And they automatically then send those people adverts for various, like for diapers and for baby stuff. And one father received it and was like, oh my God, you're saying my daughter, who was 16, you're saying my daughter's pregnant. And went down the store and confronted them. This is disgusting. Went back home and her daughter was like, Dad, I haven't told you, but I am actually pregnant. And it's a horrible story. It was 3 years ago. And so this stuff is getting better. That is better all the time. It isn't perfect.
But when you start adding in facial recognition technology, gait recognition technology, it needs to be very, very, very carefully regulated now before it gets too late to be able to regulate it.
This gentleman here.
Talking about regulation, I'm from a Dutch newspaper, Nederlands Dagblad here. When you are looking at, for instance, the director of innovation of Google, Kurzweil, he is somebody who doesn't want to see any governments anymore because the techies can run society according to his ideas. And in the end, even human beings and computers have to be combined into a kind of transhuman of, new type of human being with computers integrated in your brain.
I have a chapter about those people in my book, Radicals, in fact.
But how about if the biggest company in the earth on the stock market, Google,
Amazon, I think it's Apple and Amazon at the moment.
Oh, Apple, sorry, yes.
Yeah.
But it's one of the biggest.
Yeah.
If they have this opinion that they want to circumvent government anyway, how can you regulate them with this enormous financial and technical power? Because they don't want to be regulated.
This is why I've called my book How the Internet is Killing Democracy. Because it is a very, very difficult question. I think sometimes you have in Silicon Valley and elsewhere a genuine libertarian dislike of governments. But I think that's a remnant of the 90s. I think more common now is just this insane optimism that technology will solve every social problem. And Zuckerberg, for example, is not a libertarian. He's a communitarian. He just believes in networks. We'll just create networks for everything. And if you can put people together and give them tech, you will solve social problems. This is sometimes called dataism, that every single problem in the world can be solved by throwing more data at it. This is more common in Silicon Valley, and they don't like governments because it kind of messes things up. It's inefficient, it's slow, it's bureaucratic. They're all the things that are kind of quite good about governments sometimes, that they're slow, but it's done kind of properly because you've got to check this and check that. And so one of the ways that I think, okay, so for the first, and I wrote about this as well, because I write about the power of these monopolies in terms of lobbying, for example. I mean, Google is the biggest spender on money in Washington, D.C. now. Is, for a long time, governments just loved technology because they thought it was cool and it was the future and it was hip. And these weren't crony capitalists because they were going to work in T-shirts and jeans. So they're not like the old guys. The really bad capitalists wear bankers' hats and ties. And I think that time is gone. Politicians no longer look up to the technology giants with this adoration and amazement. And that's step number one, really important. And that partly reflects public opinion shifting. This is why I think all these negative stories and people complaining are quite good, because it's encouraging politicians to be bolder and braver. The European Union, and one of the things I write about in here is that the European Union is actually starting to take the fight back to these companies again. It's a big enough market that Google and Amazon will not ignore it. This is why Brexit's really frustrating, because we're jumping out of a regulatory system that's quite powerful. And you must have all followed this GDPR stuff. You know, getting all those emails, which was brilliant because you just ignore them all. It was great, I loved it. About GDPR, this is really important. I think we should be, as citizens, trying to make sure this is enforced, i.e. phoning up the data regulators and saying, I don't think my data's been lost. And you know, one of the rights you have under GDPR, data portability, you can go to Facebook and say, I want all the data you have about me, I want it, give it to me. And they have to work out a way of doing that. So citizens can start to act on the regulations that we've now put in place to do something. So it's amazing, even in the time that this book was written, this Cambridge Analytica story also really helped. There's been a real pushback, and actually for a lot of the younger generation, I sense they're getting fed up with all this. They're getting really annoyed with all this technology. I think it's my age group that's the worst. We're always moaning about our kids. Oh, our kids are always on the internet. We're always on the internet and our kids are looking at us. So there is a responsibility on all of us, I think, to lobby our politicians, to make it understood we care about this stuff, probably bring our kids up slightly better as well on this, enforce the rules that we have, and that is a great start.
Would be great, because if one of my daughters uses my computer
Second.
and I open it...
One can you use the microphone?
That also would be on a different level, would be great, because if one of my daughters uses my computer and looks for bikinis or dresses, the next morning when I open the laptop on my work, I have to explain why all these girls are popping up on the screen. Because the adverts are very fast.
Is anyone else?
I have an idea about the advert thing. You should go on there and just click on a load of random stuff just to try to confuse the models that are being built. Tell your friends beforehand you're doing it, though.
That hand in the back has been up for a little while.
Thanks. What do you think we as individuals can do to navigate specifically internet news media, where it's often a bit of a battle for perspectives, and it seems that most news media online have an agenda to push you, and especially because there's a lot of seemingly rogue news media online. What can an individual consumer do to navigate?
What do you do? What do you do?
I try to fact check, but it's very tiring and also very frustrating, because you can just let's say I want to unwind and just scroll a bit, and then all of a sudden I'm stuck in this like 1 hour rabbit hole, searching for whether or not what I read was real or fake. And
Yeah.
it's very tiring.
Yeah, that is. I have the same thing. I end up in these weird little places that are a million miles from where I started, and I'm suddenly. It's almost like you have this moment where you're like, "Oh my God, what have I just done? It's 10 o'clock. What?"
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what can you do? This is a difficult one. One of the things. I mean, the obvious thing is to. It's never been easier to see different people's opinions than it is today. I mean, it's never been easier to not be in an echo chamber. It's never been easier to find different information, to fact check. The question is, how are you approaching that different information? Are you going into it with an open mind? A philosopher friend of mine calls it a principle of charity. When you see someone that you strongly disagree with, think in your own mind, what is the best possible argument that they can make for that, rather than the worst possible argument and the worst motives? And then at the very least, I think you're trying to understand where other people are coming from in a slightly more positive way. The way I see it is a lot of us are responsible for this anger and frustration online. We'd say everybody else is mean and cruel, but we go on there and just immediately hammer out responses and call people idiots and fascists and all the rest of it. So we all have a responsibility to slightly lower the tone. What can any one person do? It's not much, but everyone together, I think, can make a noticeable difference, because I think we can all feel like the tension's just going up all the time at the moment. One other thing that I think that is actually like practical, and this seems so sad, but I have to try to not check my phone, like work on that, work on my powers of attention. Right, I'm only going to look at it between this hour and this hour. Right, I'm going to read for an hour without doing anything. Oh, I'm not going to check it until now, and da-da-da-da-da. To try to slowly regain the powers of sort of concentration and focus. Because I think that's really, really important. Every citizen has a duty to be thoughtful, to make difficult moral decisions. I find one of the problems you go online is you can get swept away with the crowd. They're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and it's very easy. But you shouldn't do that as a citizen. You've got to think about it for yourself, and that requires attention and focus and concentration, and each of us can work on that. Like we do going to the gym or dieting or whatever it is, or giving up caffeine. I think it's the same now with attention, and you should take it just as seriously.
We have a question down here.
Oh, now you young gentlemen are the people that are going to have to solve this problem for us, I'm afraid.
Now, if democracy disappears or dies, what political system you think will replace democracy, and why do you think that?
Dutch kids are smart, aren't they? Jeez. Dutch kids are so smart. That is a really difficult question to answer. One of the scary statistics at the moment is that on the Economist's Index of Democracies, over 50% of democracies in the last 3 years, I think, have become less democratic. So it's more that democracies are becoming less and less democratic. The press isn't quite as free as it was. The judges aren't quite as independent as they were. There's not as much political plurality. And you know, when I talked about authoritarians who come in and say, we can fix these problems, and maybe they'll blame the judges, maybe they'll blame the immigrants, maybe they'll blame whoever, but I'm the strong man to solve this. The kind of Hungary model of politics, if you like. That's one quite obvious way that we're heading, which is sort of quasi-democratic. Democratic kind of in name, but not really in practice. The scary thing for me, we always imagined that countries like China would just become democratic somehow magically. No one ever really told me how, but we just imagined that a big middle class would turn up and they'd all want democracy. But they are developing a different system, which is to become world leaders in artificial intelligence and technology, centralized data, mass surveillance, but that provides stability, growth, and jobs for people. Singapore, not really democratic, but actually wealthy and stable. So my worry is that lots of people might actually prefer that to a rough democracy that's not really great, doesn't function that well, economic growth isn't brilliant. They're the two. I can't tell you which. I mean, I don't know. But I think it's a really important thing to at least acknowledge that democracy is not a given. It's not certain that it survives. And unfortunately, you guys in the front row are going to have to fix this all for us. I don't know, so thanks for coming.
Anyone else?
I had a question about your rather pessimistic view of information overload.
Yes.
Don't you think that this is not a crisis but just something very natural? Because starting from the printing press, the radio, the television, email, we've always had information overload, and this is just the latest form.
Okay, yeah. No, I don't think that. But I think it's a good question, of course. The way that I sometimes think about this with the invention of the printing press is that everything in the end was good. I mean, you know, the Dutch were able to throw off the chains of the Spanish Empire. We had the Reformation, we had the Enlightenment, thanks to the printing press. But it wasn't before we had an awful lot of massive problems in society. Reformation, counter-reformation, oppression. Same with the Industrial Revolution. Great in the long run. Millions of people lost their livelihoods. We had 10-year-olds up chimneys. We had, you know, unbelievably bad working conditions. We had the urban areas were filled up and the rural areas were drained of people and talent. I mean, and you could maybe say that it's a similar thing now. I never understand why people refer to the printing press and the Industrial Revolution and say, look, see, everything was all right. And I'm like, it wasn't all right for a long time afterwards. It was really difficult. And I kind of feel that's where we are. The job is to sort of, how do we carry democracy through this difficult time? Because after both of those revolutions, we did change our systems of government. And I just think that's where we are going. I don't believe, however, that we had the same degree of information overload. We had different sorts of problems, which was that with the television and the printed press, we couldn't work out the truth very easily because there wasn't much truth there. Now there's so much information, the problem is actually figuring out what to believe, rather than having one source of information telling us what to believe. It's a different sort of problem. Our school system has not caught up to that new problem. It still hasn't been good enough to teach people about how to navigate this world. So that's another thing that I recommend in the book. The way that we consume and produce information is totally different. Our education system has changed a little bit, but really not very much to deal with this.
We have another question here.
You're a professor of philosophy of technology, right? I hope you're going to ask one question. You know more than me about this.
No, I didn't write any books about it.
Yeah, hi. You started your talk about democracy, saying that we used to have it. Well, we had it, and we were sovereign, and we could make our own choices, and that the echo chambers were probably worse than they are now because we have more access to information. The question is, did we ever really have democracy?
Yeah.
Or is it really a theory that we've had it? I mean, how informed were most people that voted or didn't vote in your case?
Yeah. Okay. So the way that I think of democracy is, I would use Winston Churchill, obviously, but he says it's the worst type of government except for all the other systems that have been tried. And it's a bit like that. It's far from perfect. It doesn't really work all of that well. But post-war, it's been a pretty stable system for large parts of the world and has delivered a pretty good combination of economic growth and freedom. Pretty good, not perfect. It can definitely be improved in all sorts of different ways. But those institutions, you know, I said, like, yes, we have more of a voice now. Yes, we can get more information. Yes, we have a platform. But those boring institutions that we set up to make that democracy work reasonably well, they're the things that are being eroded. And my worry is that what follows is not a better form of democracy. It's a much worse form of an already imperfect democracy. So I'd never say in this book that, oh, it used to be so great. Oh my God, democracy in the 80s was like the king. I loved it. No one can ever say that. But there is a real risk that it actually gets far worse. And if you look at surveys and studies, like I said, more and more people are turning off democracy. The Economist Index says countries are getting less democratic now. More and more people are saying and documenting that politics has never been so polarized, that the press has never been so weak, that local press has never been so decimated. And you add all of these things together, and it's happened at a time when this technology that was supposed to improve democracy arrived. So I definitely don't think things were perfect before, but I do think they can get a hell of a lot worse, unfortunately. As you've probably guessed, I'm quite pessimistic.
So I'll probably get, I think, 2 or 3 more questions. So then I'm going to ask a question.
Yes.
And, but we did have a yes.
I'll try and be shorter on my
Enthusiastic.
answers. My answers are just too long. I've got many lectures.
Hey, good evening. So you told us about that if you use social networks, that your data is being used and you're profiled. But there are also people that don't use those social networks.
Yes.
I understood in the Netherlands there was this rumor, I'm not sure if it's true, that if you're not on Facebook, you're being tracked by the national government surveillance system, by IVD. What is this true? And I also know that Facebook is doing shadow profiling, so if you're not on it, that they still infer a profile of you. What's the extent of this, and what do you know about this?
Can't say anything about the AFD or the AV. What is it? What is it called? The Dutch intelligence agencies? AVD? Yeah. AIVD, yeah. I don't know about that story, I'm afraid. People have often said that there's a funny Onion story that says that Facebook is basically all funded by the FBI because it's the greatest surveillance system ever built. And rather than spying on people, they worked out people will just tell you what you need to know if you give them something for free. There is rather a lot of shadow profiling being built, I think. This is by working out people that are in a network and inferences made about you, because if you don't put much on Facebook or don't use Google much or whatever, if you're in a position in a network, like you're friends with this person, this person, this person, and they all went to university together, they know with a 90% chance that you went to that university too. So you can build up. People who aren't on there, unfortunately, can have quite detailed profiles up about them based on inference. And this is a really big issue. So even the people that aren't on there, or the people that say the ads don't really work for me, or I'm not being, I'm not giving anything up, unfortunately, just living in this society, you probably are. This is why one of the things that I think is quite important is that people can be a bit more aggressive in exercising those rights. If you turn Facebook off, you may have tried it before, you go to rejoin and your profile's saved, it's still there, it just reconnects it again. To actually get off it, you have to write them a letter, and it's a really long process, but you can do it. And people for a long time have exercised those sorts of rights on other consumer affairs. They exercise their statutory rights. They buy this type of fair trade coffee and organic eggs, and they'll write letters complaining if they don't think that this is being done or that's being done. And we haven't really developed the culture to do that online yet. And I think that's one of the great sort of consumer battles for us in the next 10 years, to be a bit more normal for us to exercise those online rights.
Thank you. Anyone else? We have a hand at the back, and then I think there was one here as well, so they might be the last two.
Hello. What is exactly the mechanism how these companies like Cambridge Analytica influence the public opinion? Because it seems to me that the distribution of those ads for specific people, like Facebook itself, has the final word in it. And you mentioned that things like Brexit and Trump were they occurred because of these mechanisms, but we know that Silicon Valley, the workplace there is majorly left-wing. So how does that work?
I'm not sure they're left-wing. I'm not sure Silicon Valley's left-wing. I think it's left-wing on certain social issues, but it's actually quite right-wing on economic issues, for example. The question, though, I think is a really important one, which is the degree of influence that these companies can have over societal debates, crucially, without you knowing. That's what's really important, without there being a mechanism of accountability for it. So it has been estimated that Google could change the results of 20% of the world's elections by changing the search results that it puts out for different candidates. If it kept giving people positive stories about a candidate and negative stories about another candidate, it's been estimated that 20% of the world's elections could have gone another way. Similarly, Facebook did a survey which they thought was brilliant in 2012, where they showed a certain number of people an I voted. So if their friends had voted, they ticked a kind of box to say I voted, and they showed that to a select number of other people. And they found that voter turnout among those people that saw the I voted tick went up by, 1%. When you extrapolate that across the whole population, that could have changed the 2000 US election, because that was won by 37 votes or whatever it was in Florida. And you wouldn't know that had happened, because there's no way of holding to account the systems by which information is shown to you. This is why people seem especially terrified by the prospect of Mark Zuckerberg running for president, because you'd suddenly get loads of positive Mark Zuckerberg stories on your feed all day. That is why one of the things that I recommend, and I don't think they're doing that, by the way, but I think what's harmful is that we wouldn't know if they were doing it. So one of the recommendations is we have these kind of inspection systems in the UK to look at schools and hospitals and so on. Governments should do the same to these companies. They should be able to inspect the algorithms that are being employed to understand how they actually work. There's a huge wave of work now about algorithmic bias, algorithmic racism, how certain types of injustices are replicated because algorithms do the same thing of the data that's been put in, and if the old data was racist, then the new algorithms are going to give it even more power. So algorithms become very, very powerful in this new world, which means they need to be held accountable like any other form of power. At the moment, they're not at all. So this is one of the things that we definitely need to do.
I think was there one more question here? We have a repeat question.
These are the worst ones.
But this is the final question.
Follow-up
Before mine.
question, especially from. Did you say you were a journalist?
I am, yes.
Oh, I mean, this
Terrible.
is. Why did you?
You guys should start talking shop. It'll be great.
I wanted to ask you, if you look at the two large problems in our democracy now, that is what you described this evening, but the other large problem, which is defined by, for instance, by the World Economic Forum, is the economic inequality.
Yes.
30 plus people nowadays, this is the first year also in the Netherlands, earn less than their parents did. In the UK, 10 years ago, the financial crisis started, on average, a worker in the UK now earns £2,100 less than he or she did in 2008. The richer are becoming richer. Is not the real core of the problem? Because these are the groups, they also run these techies.
Of course, that is part of the problem, and I can't cover everything in this book. However, I think that driving inequality is also being partly driven by technology. And I think there's enough evidence out there to suggest that it is. Because increasingly, the returns on capital are getting higher and higher, i.e. who owns the capital is getting higher returns relative to labour. And that has been a pretty well documented trend over the last 25 years. And more of the economy is being run on capital, on huge, expensive, powerful technology. And you can even look at it at a very simple level. You could have, my truck driving example. If that industry is disrupted by the technology company I was with, you're going to have 10 guys with the powerful software that own the self-driving trucks receiving all of the income that was going to 250,000 people working in trucking over the US because they just need to have the intellectual property behind the code and own the software. And so while I agree that economic inequality is as important as anything else, I do think it is also part of this story.
Great.
Who are the 5 richest guys in the world? 5 biggest companies in the world by market capitalization? Silicon Valley tech firms.
So I have the concluding question, as is my right as chair.
He's standing up.
I am standing up. I've even got my own mic. So we've established that the present is shit of democracy, and that the future of democracy might be shittier. And at the end of your book, you say you give these sort of 20 recommendations of how we can improve the state of democracy for ourselves. And a lot of those recommendations are things that we can do. Now, I'm a bit suspicious personally that the acts of individuals, even in aggregate, are going to do a great deal. I would be far more interested in seeing the actual structural changes to the way democracy works in order to offset some of the dangers that you've elaborated. So, imagining that I'm, say, someone who writes policy, I'm not, but imagine I am. What could I do if I wanted to redesign democracy right now to help save it in the long run?
Oh, Jesus, dude.
It's the final question. I'm allowed.
Okay. Firstly, I do not agree with direct democracy. I don't think we want to run headfirst into more and more plebiscites and direct democracy, even though that will be quite a natural thing to do. Like, let's make democracy better, more votes for everyone on everything. I think the task is to improve representative democracy. That's going to mean votes at lower ages. That's going to be far more information flowing between people and their representatives and vice versa. More transparency in the way that decisions are made. Mm-hmm. More government investment in building and owning the technology itself that we then use so we can be more redistributive with it. I mean, there are quite a lot of things we can do, but I mean, even at core, I think it's a crisis of confidence in government.
Yeah.
Like, they've not been confident enough to do stuff. You know, and one of the little stories, one of the little anecdotes I have in this book is I went into GCHQ, which is our kind of equivalent of AIVD, but it's the listening post. It's like the National Security Agency. And it's out quite a way out of London, and it needs to be for various reasons. But it is a really drab, boring office with a rubbish coffee machine. This is going to sound boring, a rubbish coffee machine. And it's just, there's a huge queue and everyone's pissed off. I've also been in Facebook's, Google's, Twitter's headquarters. Oh my God, they have their own coffee barista, they have a sweet shop,
I
they
went to
have
the-
bean bags. Everything is amazing. You come out of university, where do you want to work? I mean, you want to go and work at one of these places because government just drags you down with the bureaucracy and everything. So governments also, with policy, they can become far more interesting places to work. Just as they were in the 60s and 70s. They were really exciting places to work. For some people, some of the time. But I'm afraid too many people leave because they're so disgruntled and frustrated, and they look over at these amazing beanbag-filled table, foosball, coffee
beer
drinking
fridges
tech
too.
firms with a beer fridge,
Yeah.
and they're like, that's where I want to go.
Just a final follow-up. One of the things that occurred to me is that, so when you were talking about in the first section, right, so the targeting of Cambridge Analytica and firms like it is it tries to flip inactive voters into active voters, right?
Yes.
And so this is premised upon voting not being...
And active voters into inactive voters,
Into
because they
inactive voters.
targeted Clinton voters to try and suppress their vote as well by saying, don't vote Clinton.
So in terms of structural things you could do democracy, is this an argument for compulsory voting, for example? Which means that it's
You're
impossible-
Australian, aren't you?
I am, yes.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah. I mean, not that we
Makes
don't
sense.
have our own problems, but this is the one thing that I think is one of the few things that I think is laudable with the Australian system. So if you don't vote, you get fined, right? And I think that that entire tactic typically fails in a milieu where voting is compulsory.
But then you're going to have loads of voters that don't actually care being forced to vote that might be even more easily swayed because they don't really have an opinion at all one way or another.
Yeah.
I think the answer there is that every single online advert that's shown that's political has to then be published along with the way that people have been targeted. Why is someone targeted? It's going to be a really long, boring Excel spreadsheet, but journalists and others will go through it, and hopefully that will dampen down on some of the worst behaviour.
Okay. I think that's probably it for the questions. But I don't know how this stall is working, but Kirsten might come up and explain. But thank you.
So there's 3 of Jamie's books for sale here, so you're welcome to come. And Jamie is willing to sign, so... And if not, then see you at the next Team Generale event. Thank you.